I told my dying father I'm glad he's finally leaving. I hadn't spoken to my father in over 20 years when that call came. It was a Tuesday morning, gray, sluggish, faceless, the kind where even the sun doesn't want to rise. The phone screen lit up with the hospital number. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up anyway. And when the soft, neutral voice of the nurse said, "Mr. Carter is in critical condition. We think you should come," my heart seemed to freeze over. For a couple of seconds, I just stared out the window. Raindrops slowly trickled down the glass, long, uneven lines, like the thoughts in my head. I hadn't heard that name, Mr. Carter, in many years. Not Dad. Not Father. Just Mr. Carter. I told myself I wouldn't go. That I owed him nothing. He'd made it clear many years ago that I was nothing to him. A weakling, a loser, a family disgrace. I'd built an entire life on the ruins of his contempt. And yet, my hands were already reaching for my jacket, while my brain tried to convince them to stop. When I entered the hospital, that smell hit me, heavy, sterile. A mix of antiseptic and despair. The hallway buzzed with cold lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a monitor beeped steadily. The nurse at the desk looked at me with that gaze, pity, sympathy, fatigue. "Room 214, she said quietly. "He's still conscious." I stood at the door for more than a minute. Long enough for the memories I tried to bury for 20 years to surface all at once. The sound of a belt slapping against the table. A scream. His voice hoarse, angry. "Stop crying, men don't cry." I was 16 the last time I heard that. That night I packed a backpack, climbed out the window and left. Forever. Now, standing at the ward door, I felt like that boy again. Only now he had gray temples and trembling hands. I pushed the door. He was small. Not the huge, domineering man whose shadow filled the whole house. Pale, thin. Skin grayish-yellow, eyes sunken. It seemed like the sheet was about to pull him in, dissolve him. The oxygen tube hissed quietly. I stood. Just watched. How many times had I imagined this moment, sometimes as forgiveness, sometimes as revenge. But reality turned out different. Empty. Cold. Emotionless. He opened his eyes when he heard the door creak. It took a few seconds for him to realize who I was. He didn't smile. Of course not. So he rasped, "You came after all." No hello, no glad to see you. Just, "You came after all." I almost turned around. But I stayed. Probably out of stubbornness or foolish hope. "The nurse said you wanted to see me," I said quietly. He turned his head, wincing. "I didn't ask. It was your aunt who insisted, said we need to make peace." He said that word like he was spitting out poison. Then he coughed, roughly, hoarsely, wrenchingly. I pulled up a chair, more to hide the tremor in my legs. He watched me, as if looking for flaws in me like before. "You've aged," he muttered. "How old are you now?" 32. You don't look like a man." The same tone. The same intonation. Even on the brink of death, the same person. Something in me broke, but quietly. Without a scream. "I thought maybe you've changed," I said. "Changed?" he smirked. "People don't change, they just get weaker." There it was. There he was, my whole father in 3 words. I don't know how long we sat. Time dragged like thick syrup. He'd fall asleep, then wake up. Mutter something, incomprehensible fragments of phrases. Once I heard him say my mother's name, Claire. And it hit me like an electric shock. He didn't even notice. He never noticed anything. The nurse came, changed the IV. Smiled politely but coldly. When she left, he turned to me. "You think you're better than me, huh?" No, I replied. I just think I survived in spite of you. His gaze sharpened, angry. Even in half-death, he found the strength to get mad. Ungrateful, he started but coughed hoarse. I stood up. My chest tightened. I wanted to leave. Wanted to leave him in this sterile hell, with his own poison. But I couldn't. Because I knew this was the last time. And if I left now, the words would stay stuck in my throat. I stepped closer. The monitor beeped steadily, reminding me that time hadn't stopped. He looked up at me, almost with contempt. "You're still the same," he whispered. "You'll hide behind your mom's skirt and wait for someone to fix your life." The same words. Literally, the same ones he said to me when I was 10. The ones I'd heard in nightmares, in therapy sessions, in every moment of doubt. Something inside me froze and turned to stone. "You know," I said slowly, "I thought I came to forgive you, or at least to say goodbye." He blinked, not reacting. "But now I realize you don't deserve either." He lifted his head slightly, as if wanting to protest. But he couldn't. "You destroyed everything you touched," I continued. "Made Mom miserable, turned me into a shadow. You called it love, but it was just power. I tried to earn your respect, but you respected nothing. Not life, not family, not love." He was silent. Only the oxygen tube hissed quietly. I leaned closer. "So here's the thing," I whispered. "I'm glad you're finally going. Maybe now I can breathe." The room froze. The monitor kept beeping steadily. He looked straight at me. And it seemed, for the first time in his life, without malice. Something like understanding flickered in his gaze. He nodded faintly, then closed his eyes. "I don't remember how I left the ward. Don't remember going downstairs, getting in the car. I only remember sitting in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, shaking. And crying, not because he was dying, but because for the first time, I said what I'd feared my whole life. I wasn't sad. I was free." When I left the hospital, the rain had almost stopped, but the sky was still low, gray, as if it couldn't decide whether to cry or just hang over the earth waiting for the end. The wind picked up wet leaf scraps and tossed them onto the asphalt, onto my hood, onto the windshield, where they slid down, leaving thin trails like veins. I sat in the car and couldn't turn the ignition key for a long time. Just stared ahead, as if somewhere in this fog an answer should appear. Why I went there at all. His phrase echoed in my head. "You're still the same." It bounced around until it turned into a hum, then silence. Maybe he was right. Deep down, I was still that boy who waited every evening for his father to come home and say at least one kind word. But instead, I heard footsteps in the hallway, the sound of a belt unbuckling, and the smell of cheap whiskey. 8 years old, and I already knew what punishment meant. He never hit just because. He always found a reason, even if it didn't exist. A broken cup, a bad grade, late for dinner. Everything became an excuse to show who was boss in the house. Mom tried to stop him, but he'd yell that he was doing it out of love and that a son needs to become a man. Back then, I didn't understand what twisted logic that was, where love is measured by pain. I remember one night especially clearly. I was 10. I accidentally spilled milk on the table. He got up from the table, grabbed me by the hair, and dragged me into the hallway. Mom rushed after us, screaming that I was just a child. He turned and hit her for the first time in front of me. I remember how she collapsed to the floor and how I, shaking, rushed to her while he stood over us, breathing heavily, muttering, "Look at yourselves. Pathetic sight." That night I hated him for the first time. Not just feared him, but truly hated him. That hatred later became my fuel, my inner engine, what kept me from dying of despair. Mom left when I turned 12. She just packed a suitcase one day, came to me, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "I'll come back for you." But she didn't come back. A year later I learned she died, a stroke. They said her heart gave out, but I knew it wasn't her heart, it was him. He killed her, not with his hands, but with years of humiliation, constant control, words that destroy slowly but surely. That's when I swore I'd never become like him. And if I ever had a family, I'd do everything the opposite. No yelling, no pain, no fear. Now, 20 years later, sitting in the car outside his hospital, I felt that oath trembling inside like cracked glass. He still had power over me, even though I thought I'd freed myself long ago. With one look, one word, he turned me back into that boy who couldn't protect his mother. Maybe that's why I said what I said. Not to finish him off, but to finally end him inside me. I started the engine but didn't move. In the rearview mirror, my own shadow flickered. A tired face, pursed lips, eyes with no anger or compassion, just emptiness. I remembered how he stood at my graduation and didn't say a word. Everyone around was congratulating and he just shrugged and said, "Well, at least you did something right." That's when I realized nothing I did would ever be enough for him. And maybe that's why I'd spent my whole life trying to prove to the world that I was worth something. Work, career, awards, all of it was not for me but against him. When Mom died, he didn't come to the funeral, said he didn't want to see that tragedy. And a week later, he married another woman. I didn't even know her name until I accidentally saw a photo in the newspaper. He was some minor official back then, and they were photographed at some charity reception. He stood with a glass of champagne, smiling, as if his whole life was flawless. I looked at that photo and felt everything inside me contract with disgust and helplessness. It was a few years before I learned he had another son, my half-brother. I never saw him. He didn't know I existed, and honestly, I didn't want him to. I didn't want to be part of that family, part of his legacy. But now, with Dad dying, I suddenly caught myself thinking that maybe this guy would come to the funeral, that he'd stand by the coffin, not understanding what a monster the man everyone called a good father really was. And it terrified me. Not death, but that evil can live on after death in others' memories as a beautiful lie. I turned on the headlights and drove. The road was wet, slippery, but I drove fast, almost without thinking. Fragments of phrases from childhood echoed in my head, and I couldn't silence them. When I was a teenager, he loved saying, "You're too soft. Nothing will come of you." That's when I first wrote a short story just to escape reality. The teacher praised me, said I had talent, and for the first time I felt proud. But when I showed Dad, he just smirked. Writing fairy tales, that's what you've come to. From then on, I never showed him anything I did. And maybe that's why I became a journalist, to prove that words can be stronger than fists. That night I didn't go home. I drove to the lake, the old place where Mom and I used to walk in summer when he was away on business trips. The water was dark, calm, and in the reflection I saw myself, an adult man still seeking forgiveness that might never come. I pulled an old photo from the glove compartment, me, Mom, and Dad. I was about 6 then. We stood on the beach and I was smiling. Back then, I still believed family was forever. I looked at the snapshot and realized that smile had died long ago with her. I crumpled the photo and threw it into the water. The paper soaked instantly, the image blurred, and it seemed like part of my past was drowning with it. Not the pain, not the anger, but that part still waiting for his love. For the first time in 20 years, I felt relief, quiet but real. I got home at dawn. The apartment was dark, cold, and when I turned on the light, I suddenly felt uneasy. In the kitchen, a cup stood with unfinished coffee, laptop open to an article I was working on. Everything looked as if I'd returned not from the hospital but from another time. I sat on a chair and caught myself thinking that I had nothing more to write about others. I needed to tell my own story. Not for him, for me. The phone rang that same evening when I'd finally felt some peace. The number was unknown, but I already knew who it was. I don't know how exactly. I just felt that familiar pressure in my chest, that pulling feeling that always comes before something inevitable. I didn't want to answer. I stared at the screen until the call ended, then the second, then the third. Only on the fourth did I pick up. "Is this Viktor Pavlovich's son?" A woman's voice, tired but soft. "Sorry it's late, he's gone." I didn't respond right away. Deep down, I'd expected those words, but now that they'd been said, it still felt like something snapped. Not in my heart, there was nothing left there long ago, but in the air around, in the silence itself. as if the world paused for a second, waiting for what I'd say. "Thank you," I said quietly, almost mechanically. "He left you an envelope, asked to deliver it personally." I froze. "An envelope?" I asked. "Yes, with your name. He said you'd understand when you read it. You can pick it up tomorrow in the ward." I thanked her and hung up, but then sat in the dark for a long time, staring into nothing. He was dead. And that was it, just like that. No scream, no last look, no apology, no repentance, just an envelope. And now that envelope was like a key I didn't want to turn. The next day I went anyway. Not for him, for me. I wanted to put a final, bold period so I'd never return to that name. The morgue was cold and smelled of antiseptic. White walls echoing footsteps, indifferent faces of the orderlies. All of it evoked a strange sense of detachment, as if I was watching it not through my own eyes but through frosted glass. The nurse, the same one who called, silently handed me a white envelope. On it were just 3 words: "For my son, personally." I didn't open it right away. I went outside, breathed in the damp air, got in the car and just sat, holding this piece of paper in my hands, as if there was something alive in it. My heart beat slowly but heavily, as if it knew there was something inside I didn't want to know. I opened it. The handwriting was uneven, trembling. The ink had smudged in places, as if he'd written while gasping for breath. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I don't know why you came, but I'm grateful you did. I've thought a lot about you in the last months. Not about who you've become, but about who I didn't let you be. I destroyed everything I touched. And probably the worst part, I didn't even realize it then. When your mother died, I blamed everyone but myself. But I should have blamed only myself. She died because of me, and you knew that. In her things, I found letters she wrote to you but never got to send. I couldn't give them to you. They've been with me all this time, in the old desk drawer. If you want, take them. If not, burn them. Forgive me if you can. Father." I reread those lines several times, feeling nothing. Then I suddenly realized I was gripping the paper so hard my fingers turned white. Mom's letters. All this time they were with him. 20 years. He hid them like a trophy, like a memory of his crime, or like punishment for himself, for me, for both of us. I don't remember how I got to his house. The old wooden house on the outskirts where I hadn't been since childhood. Everything looked as if time had stopped. Peeling walls, rusty railings, creaky steps. The door was unlocked. Apparently, no one had been there since his hospitalization. Inside was the same smell as before. A mix of old furniture, dust, and something heavy, metallic, as if the house itself was soaked in guilt. I went up to the second floor to his office. The desk was in the same place where he used to slam his fist when angry. The top drawer opened with difficulty, as if resisting. Inside, under a stack of yellowed papers, I found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. In Mom's handwriting, "For my son, when he grows up." I sat right on the floor, stared at them for a long time, afraid to open. Then I untied the ribbon anyway. The first letter was short. "Baby, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there. But no, I love you more than life. If you're scared, just look at the sky. There's always light there, even when clouds cover the sun." I didn't notice the tears starting. I hadn't cried in probably 10 years. And now I just sat on the cold floor and read these letters, one after another. "You're not to blame for his anger. Don't believe him when he says you're weak. You're strong because you know how to feel." Every word was like a slap and medicine at the same time. She knew everything, knew what was happening, knew what I was going through, and still tried to protect me, at least with words. And he deprived me of that. When I finished the last letter, the sun was setting. The room plunged into twilight, and only a beam of light pierced through the dusty window, illuminating the bundle of letters on the floor. I looked at them and felt something changing inside. Not the pain. It wasn't going anywhere. but as if that piece of the boy who'd been screaming inside me all this time was finally heard. I stood up, went to the desk, and opened the drawer again. There in the corner was an old photo, him and Mom still young, smiling. I took it, looked, and suddenly realized, once he might have really loved her, then something broke, and from that something a monster grew. I didn't forgive him, but I understood, and that might be worse than forgiveness. I left the house at night. The moon hung low, reflecting in the windows, and the air seemed almost transparent. I stood on the threshold and suddenly said aloud, for the first time in all these years, "I'm no longer your son," and added quieter, almost a whisper, "But I am hers." I took the letters with me. At home, I neatly placed them in a box, put it on the shelf next to the photo where Mom and I are together, and realized that's all I needed to keep. Several months passed. I wrote an article, not about him directly, but about people like him, about those who hide monsters under masks of fathers, teachers, heroes. It went viral. Hundreds of people wrote to me, some shared their stories, some just thanked me for saying what they couldn't. One day I got a letter. "I'm your half-brother. I read your article. I didn't know what our father was like. But thank you for telling the truth. Maybe now I can be a different person." I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing what to reply. Then I just wrote, "Be who he couldn't be," and sent it. Since then I haven't gone back to that street, that house, that past. Sometimes I dream of Mom, sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea, smiling. I wake up and in my chest it's not pain but a strange calm, because now I know I didn't just survive him. I stepped out of his shadow. And if he could see me now, I wouldn't say thank you or I forgive you, but simply, "It's over now. You have no more power. I'm free." It's been almost half a year since I read Mom's last letter and burned Dad's house to the ground. Though, to be precise, I didn't burn the house itself. I just let it die along with the past that kept me chained. I sold the lot, cleared out everything of value, and left the land empty, without foundation, without memories, without pain. Let grass grow there. Let the wind scatter the ashes. Let no one know that once a man lived there who only knew how to break. Since then, life started changing. Not abruptly, not like a movie scene, but quietly, almost unnoticed, like the first sounds of spring after a long winter. I started sleeping without nightmares. I started writing again. Not articles, not confessions, but real texts, stories where there are no monsters, but people who choose to be different. One day, I woke up with the feeling that I needed to go somewhere. It wasn't a planned or spontaneous decision, just an inner call, the kind you feel when it's time to close the circle. I got ready, got in the car, and drove to where I hadn't been since I was a teenager, the cemetery where Mom rests. The road was long, winding, but I drove calmly. The radio played old songs she loved, melodies she danced to in the kitchen when everything was still bright. I caught myself smiling, not from joy but from some quiet gratitude. Memory isn't always pain. Sometimes it's just warmth frozen in the heart. When I entered the cemetery, the sun was already setting. The air was thick, smelling of damp earth and fresh flowers. I found her grave almost immediately, though so many years had passed. The marble had darkened a bit, the inscription faded, but the portrait remained the same, eyes full of life. I stood for a long time, not saying a word. Then sat on a bench and just breathed. "Hi, Mom," I said finally. "I haven't come for a long time, I know, not because I forgot, just couldn't." The silence was kind, not oppressive, not accusing, just a quiet presence. I felt as if she was really there, as if listening. "He died," I said after a minute. I didn't cry, and I didn't rejoice, I just let go. I don't know if he deserved anything, but probably everyone leaves as they lived, in silence. I exhaled and looked down at the ground. "You know, I found your letters, all of them. He kept them. I don't know why. Maybe he wanted me to read them someday. Maybe he was just afraid to burn them, but I read them. Every word. I cried, Mom. Hear that, me? A grown man who thought he'd been through it all, sat on the floor and cried like a child. And you know it was right. Because for the first time in so many years, I felt not shame, not fear, but love. The kind you left in those letters. I pulled a folded sheet from my pocket, not an old letter, but a new one. Mine. I wrote it yesterday, not knowing why, but now I understood. I unfolded it and started reading aloud. Mom, I lived in the shadow for a long time. I tried to prove I wasn't like him, but that only kept him closer. Now I live differently. I'm not afraid I'll become a monster because I remember who he was and who you were. I'm no longer angry, not at him, not at myself, not at life. I just live. And probably that's what you always wanted. Thank you for the light. Your son. I carefully placed the letter under the flowers, smoothed the earth with my hand, and smiled. It's all good, Mom. Now it's really good. On the way back, I stopped at the riverbank, the same one where we used to go with her in summer when I was little. The water was calm, almost mirror-like, and in the reflection, for the first time in a long while, I saw not a tired, broken person, but someone alive. Not perfect, not a saint, just alive. I sat on a rock, pulled out an old lighter from my pocket, the one left from Dad. I twirled it in my hands for a long time, watching the light glint slide over the metal. Then, without hesitating, threw it into the water. Let it sink. Let it stay where it belongs, at the bottom. When the lighter's flame went out under the water, I felt an invisible weight lift from my shoulders. I just sat and watched the sun set. And in that moment I realized, silence no longer scares me. It's my home. Several weeks passed. I got a letter, not from relatives, not from publishers, but from a woman named Anna. She wrote, I read your article. I care for my father who was cruel to me in childhood. Your words help me understand that I have the right not to forgive, but at the same time, not to hate. Thank you. I reread that letter several times. At some point I realized, I no longer write to vent pain. I write so someone else stops drowning in theirs. And maybe that's the meaning of everything I've been through. Today I live in a different apartment, small but bright. I have no photos of Dad, but there's Mom on that one photo where we're laughing. Sometimes I talk to her out loud, not because I expect an answer, but because it's become a habit. And every time I say Mom, it no longer hurts. I brew tea, open the window, let in the evening air and think. Maybe forgiveness isn't words. It's just the moment when you choose to live, even if the past left scars. I'm not a saint. I'm not a hero. I'm just a person who survived. And now lives. Sometimes I imagine her looking at me from that photo. Her gaze is warm as if saying, now you've understood. And I nod, whisper back, yes, Mom, now I've understood. And that's all that's needed.